Hey guys, I want to welcome you to the weekly Wednesday for the Financial Freedom newsletter, where every week, every Wednesday, we delve into something inspirational, motivational, something excerpt taken from the Financial Freedom weekly newsletter. Wherever you are, if you're listening on Spotify, on iTunes, Google, be sure to click the like, subscribe, share, comment. And without ado, let's get into the show. Hey guys, welcome to this week's podcast episode for the Financial Freedom Podcast. And I'm your host, Dr. Christopher Liu. As you know, I'm always in the field for attracting top talent, the top minds, getting their insights and distinctions and applying them. So today I'm happy to welcome Mark Graban. He's a business book author. He's a professional speaker, podcast of My Favorite Mistake, Careers in Business, Growth and Lessons, Learn from Mistakes and Failures. And he's an entrepreneur. And I love talking to individuals such as himself, cross-pollinating. And so I'm happy to welcome Mark to the show. Welcome.
Christopher, thank you. It's good to be here.
What's interesting is, connected through Podmatch, and tell other people about your story, your background, and we'll get into the meat of it.
Yeah, the longer story, I'll give the short version of the longer story of my career arc. I'm an industrial engineer with master's degrees in engineering and business who thought I was going to have a career in manufacturing companies. But then in 2005, I kind of stumbled into an opportunity to bring some of the systems improvement and process improvement concepts that I learned there into healthcare. When I was hired in 2005 by Johnson & Johnson, they had a consulting unit that worked with medical laboratories and hospitals. So we talk about cross-pollinating ideas. I think I'm part of some of that cross-pollination into healthcare. And I tell you, there are things I've learned in healthcare that I try to share back, with people in other industries.
I love that. You're also, what's interesting is you, one thing we'll get into it is we'll talk about leadership, culture. One thing you author of the Shingo award-winning book, Lean Hospitals, Improving Quality, Patient Safety, Employee Engagement. Looks like Healthcare Kaizen as well. Executive Guide to Healthcare Kaizen. Yeah. Tell people about this, your writings, the work that you've been doing, learning.
So my first couple of books that you mentioned there were definitely healthcare improvement, healthcare management books. The Lean Hospitals, for people who don't know, I pause to say this and ask people, if you keep an open mind, that these are ideas that come from manufacturing. A lot of it comes from Toyota, with the recognition that a hospital is, of course, very different than a factory, right? This is not about, quote unquote, assembly line medicine, which people always mean as a very negative thing, right? Lean Hospital is trying to become the best hospital it can be. The subtitle of the book emphasizes the things that I think are key in whatever order: patient safety, quality and outcomes of care, employee engagement. The subtitle, if it were longer, would include things like, let's say, patient experience, employee safety. And you'll notice the word cost is not anywhere there in the title or the subtitle, because in this lean approach to improving or managing organizations, cost is not the primary goal or directive. We see lower cost being an end result of doing everything else well, starting with safety and quality of care and creating a better work environment. The book Healthcare Kaizen is sort of an extension of, it's a deeper dive around like daily continuous improvement mindsets. The word Kaizen from Japanese translates basically to mean good change, in the context of creating a culture where everybody is able to participate in reducing frustrations and improving patient care. Involving everybody in that is often referred to as Kaizen, but it really thankfully has nothing to do with being Japanese, which I am not. It has nothing to do with being in Japan, which I am not. But these are methods that are really being used around the world. And when they're being used with a good fidelity to what this is all supposed to be, great things happen. The one problem, and the thing I do realize, is that There are a lot of articles written about how lean is bad. And what they're describing in those articles, I don't recognize as lean. And I think that's a shame. Lean is really, it's supposed to be helpful for everybody involved.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. And I guess, healthcare is kind of one of those quintessential industries, it's kind of ossified for lack of a better term. But you talk about, leadership, culture. And so we'll just talk about, lessons from different exponential organizations and how they can be applied to healthcare. So one is how leaders can help employees feel safe of speaking up about mistakes or ideas.
Yeah, I think that's the way to think of it. Instead of telling employees to be brave or lecturing them, I've heard people say sometimes, like talking to nurses, like, it's your professional obligation to speak up and disagree with that powerful surgeon. I'm like, that just seems unreal. To put that sort of burden on people, it's really upon, let's say, the more powerful people in a hierarchy, whether that's a surgeon in an operating room or attendings working with residents, or even thinking of administrators being in that hierarchy, whether they're clinicians or not. They set the tone. They create the conditions in which people can feel more safe to speak up without being yelled at or punished or fired or losing the interesting case assignments. The onus is really on leaders and those in formal power or even informal power positions, not just encourage people to speak up, but react when people do speak up, react in ways that reinforces, okay, we mean it. We're not just trying to tell you it's safe. We're demonstrating that it's safe to speak up. That's either pointing out problems, risks, mistakes, or even just speaking up about ideas for improvement. We really need to emphasize, looking at helping people feel safe, not just telling them that they should feel safe.
Drawing lessons from outside, because, interdisciplinary, kind of get ideas. You talk about lessons from Toyota, but one thing that, studying like companies, some of the most innovative companies, Apple, Google, Facebook, Microsoft, all these really tech companies. And I think that the future the most valuable healthcare companies are going to be tech companies. But so tell us more how hospitals can more draw from lessons of tech companies and how they can incorporate, get better.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to think about there. That's a really interesting question. I mean, we can include Amazon.
Yeah,
I get emails all the time about Amazon Pharmacy, and if Amazon is going to be, they've bought One Medical. So what's going to happen? As they're operating clinics, that's a interesting dose of competition. But I think when you go back to a culture where innovation or even small scale improvement happens, there's a lot of lessons from entrepreneurship and startup space. For one, I think maybe just back for a second to this theme of what people call psychological safety. One of the key studies around that topic was done by Professor Amy Edmondson from Harvard, who actually worked with Google. She's done similar work with healthcare organizations, but in particular, Google posed this question of why are certain teams or business units more successful than others? And what they found was that the key variable was the level of psychological safety. When people are feeling safe to challenge the status quo, to disagree with their boss, to speak up with ideas, to iterate on ideas without fear of being punished for quote unquote failure. That was a key driver at Google. And you look at other startups, the big famous unicorns, or they're beyond unicorns, the companies you mentioned, or even, smaller scale startups. Like in my book, there's a story in there from Spotify of learning from mistakes they made in their innovation process, of realizing innovation is by nature messy, even if you do things perfectly. You can't always expect things to go exactly as predicted, because one of my podcast guests, Rich Sheridan, he's the CEO of a tech company in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Rich said, the company's Menlo Innovations, sorry. But what Rich said, I think is very true. If all of your experiments work out as predicted, they're not really experiments. So, I think there's a time and a place to bring some of that innovation thinking into healthcare. There's a time and a place. So like when we're trying to do new things, like innovating and experimenting in ways that aren't creating any sort of risk to patients, right? I'm not talking about pharmaceutical development, but if we're talking about, establishing, a new style of integrated cancer treatment facility, to realize that you're going to have an iterative approach to the design of the facility, to the design of the customer experience, even if the clinical care is like pretty well known and solid or ever evolving. So I think there's lessons where learning from mistakes is key. In some aspects of healthcare, we want to work really hard to prevent things like wrong site surgeries, to prevent medication errors, and when they happen, react constructively so that we can learn. But then when we're trying to do things that are maybe more on that frontier of innovation, you almost have to expect mistakes or invite mistakes and seize on that as, your opportunity, progress and learning.
Yeah, it seems like really this idea of allowing mistakes to happen and this area of psychological safety, of course, patient safety, healthcare quality, all these, are utmost. But why is it a mistake for executives to try basically explain every up and down, in this process? Tell us more how they can learn from these leaders and incorporate into their organizations.
Well, so maybe to clarify, when you say every up and down, are you saying it would be a mistake for leaders like be too prescriptive in how the work is done, or I want to make sure I understand what you're saying?
Yeah, so basically, executives really so they have everything, the input from, staffing, from middle, they're from top. So how do they, basically there's this narrative and there's this directive, that the organization has to follow, but then there's also this area of explanation and, experimentation. So my question is like, really, how did these executives have to be in order to kind of reconcile these two differences?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think what you're pointing to is the need for balance, figuring out the best way to do something in our workplace, the best way to insert a central line in a hospital. There's certain known best practice that would lead to zero infections, often for a very extended period of time. There are some hospitals that have demonstrated that to be possible. So let's say an executive goes to a conference or learns, okay, well, here's what hospital X did. We're going to just copy what they did, and that's going to lead to zero central line infections. Like that, I would consider that a hypothesis as opposed to a known truth. You don't know what things are different about your environment in that other hospital. I mean, I would encourage people to use what some other hospital did as a starting point, but then review that and get input from the clinicians and the experts at the front line to review, because there might be the need to do something differently in your location. But then if we modify what that other organization did, like hopefully it's based on a prediction of it being as effective, if not better, right? And then not just because we want to do it differently or because of our habit or the way we've always done it here. You have to sort through the sometimes difficult conversations of the way one clinician has done it and the way another clinician has done it. At some point, you've got to look at data. Which method is most likely to prevent infections and provide other good outcomes. So whatever we've decided on moving forward with, or even to test two things in parallel, that's the beginning of an iterative process where I think if you modified what that other hospital did because you wanted to, not because you had to, and you try that, and it's like, well, okay, infection rates are better, but they're not zero. Should we now try and accept that maybe what that other hospital did was better? If we're being evidence-based and patient-focused, I mean, there's this balance to be found between looking at the way other people have done things versus also engaging your people to say, well, can we make this even better? I think you've got to be careful when you try forcing new ways of doing things on people. It's human nature to say, well, I don't want you to tell me how to do my work, whether it's patient care or otherwise. There's this balance of like helping people learn, helping them feel safe, challenging things. At the same time, you might need to push back and say, okay, look, there's pretty solid evidence that doing it this way will result in a good outcome like zero infections. Let's try it. Let's get comfortable with it. Let's evaluate the experiment.
Yeah. Yeah. We're kind of running towards the end, but you have this idea of process behavior charts and how they can help leader. Elaborate.
Yeah, so that's from a previous book. I'm going to hold it up here. A previous book called Measures of Success. The subtitle tries to explain the gist of the book in 6 words: react less, lead better, improve more. So a process behavior chart is a specific type of what people would call a control chart or a statistical process control chart. It's basically
Go ahead. Sorry.
Should I start the answer again?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Measures of Success is my previous book. I'll hold it up here. Measures of Success. The subtitle tries to summarize it in 6 words: react less, lead better, improve more. So a process behavior chart is a specific type of what's often called a control chart. So it's basically a line chart. We plot data over time. It could be some quality measure in a department. It could be your weight on the scale every morning. And you look at the line chart, but then you calculate, let's say if this measure seems to be stable over time, you calculate the average, and then you calculate what we call the lower limits and the upper limit. And that provides some guardrails to where we can tell the difference between, if you will, signals, meaning, like if this data point's an outlier, the system has changed, separating signal from noise, because the trap organizations fall into far too often is basically reacting to every up and down in a data point. And when we're reacting and trying to demand explanations or a root cause for every fluctuation in a metric that's really just stable over time, that ends up being a waste of time. It distracts from what people need to do, to really try to drive improvement. So for example, quick example, patient satisfaction scores are lower than last month. We need to have a meeting. We need to understand why. Well, guess what? Like, they tend to sort of they're fluctuating up and down. Like, we need to step back and look at the system. And instead of asking, why is that number worse than last month, regardless of what N was, we'd step back and say, well, the average seems to be 85. What are the barriers to better levels of patient satisfaction surveys, and look at trying to really step back and improve the system and its performance instead of just trying to explain every data point.
Yeah, really interesting conversation. I'm really going to check out your books. How can people follow you, check out your work, contact you?
Yeah, people can go to either markgraban.com or they can go to Mistakes. They can find information about the books, the podcast, My Favorite Mistake. Books are available on Amazon, and people can find me mainly on LinkedIn in terms of social media platforms.
Yeah. And for all the listeners out there, let's thank Mark for coming onto the show. Really interesting. And, again, one of the big industries that needs to get with the program is healthcare. And all of Mark's resources will be in the links and show notes. And thanks so much for coming onto the podcast.
Yeah. Thank you, Christopher. Really appreciate it. Thanks for your questions.
I hope you really enjoyed that wonderful, inspirational, motivational piece. Again, wherever you are listening, if you liked it, be sure to like, comment, share, subscribe. We're on everywhere: Spotify, iTunes, Google, Amazon, Audible. And without much ado, be sure to thank this show's sponsors, and we'll see you next week.